Richard Deacon knew the score. He didn't need to flaunt it. A man of quiet presence, a businessman in Chasetown, Staffordshire, yet his reputation stretched far beyond the glossy storefronts and upscale homes of the town. It was the kind of place where rumors festered, where the upper class and the underworld often brushed shoulders in the shadows. Deacon's name was whispered in both corners, the kind of whispers that suggested he moved in circles that most couldn't even imagine. But he wasn't flashy, not like some of the others. No, Deacon was discreet. He kept a low profile, but behind the curtains, things were far from ordinary. He had built his empire on subtlety, on making the right connections, knowing who to speak to, who to trust, and who to ignore. He wasn't the type to go around boasting about his wealth or his influence. No, he had something else. A sense of power that wasn't immediately obvious to anyone who wasn't paying attention. He lived well, very well. His home on Midway Street was a quiet, upscale place, the kind of house that exuded unstated wealth. It didn't go unnoticed, but Deacon's lifestyle, though enviable, was often attributed to his business ventures. The truth was more complicated than that. By 2010, Richard Deacon had cemented himself as a key figure in Chasetown. He had built a network, a web of influence that allowed him to operate with ease in the world of both legitimate business and underground dealings. His rise wasn't a sudden one. It had been slow, calculated, and deliberate. People noticed him more and more as the months passed. Some admired him, others feared him. But everyone knew his name. Despite his wealth, despite his standing, there was always talk about where his money truly came from. Was it all legal? Of course it was. On paper, Deacon was a self-made man, an entrepreneur who had made smart investments and seized opportunities in the real estate market. But there were whispers. People talked about the money that seemed to pour in from every direction. The rumors ran wild. Money from drugs, from deals that no one quite understood, but everyone suspected. No one had solid proof, and Deacon knew how to keep it that way. He had friends, but he had enemies too. A few of those enemies were people with a lot more to lose than they were willing to admit. They never spoke out of turn, not openly, but it was clear in the way they acted when Deacon was around. The way they looked at him, the way they avoided his gaze when they were in the same room. He wasn't someone you crossed easily, but crossing him was not always a matter of choice. Sometimes it was just business. Deacon's wealth came from somewhere, and it wasn't from honest dealings alone. The more you dug into it, the murkier the waters got. There were connections to known criminals, to people who had no place in the legitimate business world. But no one could say for sure, nothing concrete. That's how Deacon kept it clean, on the surface. But there were cracks, and through those cracks, people could see the true nature of what he was building. I had been following him for some time now. There were rumors about his involvement in organized crime, drug trafficking, money laundering, smuggling. I couldn't prove any of it, but there were always pieces of the puzzle that didn't fit. I had my suspicions, just like everyone else. I'd seen men like Deacon before. Men who seemed to have it all, but whose success was rooted in something far darker than they let on. One night, as I sat in my car across from his house, watching the lights flicker in his windows, I thought about how this game was always the same. You followed the money, followed the people, and waited for something to slip. Everyone had their weakness, and it was only a matter of time before Deacon's would surface. But for now, he was untouchable. The authorities had their eyes on him, but without hard evidence, there was nothing they could do. So, we waited, watched, listened. The rumors were enough to keep him on our radar, but without something more concrete, there was little we could do except wait for him to make a mistake. And they always did. Everyone did. That was the thing about people like Richard Deacon. They thought they were too clever, too careful to slip up, but I knew better. In a world like this, one small misstep, one bad decision, could bring everything crashing down. As Deacon's influence in Chasetown grew, so did the attention he attracted. The more successful he became, the more people started to take notice. not just the people who admired him, but those who felt threatened by his presence. Deacon had always been careful, keeping his dealings low-key, but in the criminal underworld, power always invites conflict. The question was no longer just if he would be targeted, but when. Rival gangs in Staffordshire were starting to feel the pressure. Deacon's success wasn't just from his legitimate businesses. It was clear that he had deeper connections, ones that stretched into murky waters. As his network expanded, it began to infringe on territories controlled by other criminal figures. Deacon, by all accounts, had been encroaching on business that others had spent years building. The streets of Chasetown weren't as quiet as they used to be, and those who had once been on the periphery of the city's criminal scene began to notice the cracks in Deacon's operation. One of the first signs that things were shifting was a botched drug shipment that came through town. Deacon had a deal lined up with a supplier from London, high-quality product, a large shipment, and a big payout. Everything was set, or so it seemed. The shipment arrived at the docks, but something went wrong. The delivery didn't just get delayed, it was intercepted. Someone had tipped off the authorities. It wasn't just a mistake, it was sabotage. At first, Deacon kept his cool. His reputation was on the line, and he couldn't afford to show weakness. He met with his key people, his inner circle, ordering them to track down whoever had sabotaged the deal. But in the world Deacon played in, sabotage didn't come from nowhere. It was always a message. Someone had made a move, and Deacon knew that. He'd made enemies, and now they were coming for him. The rumors started circulating almost immediately. Word on the street was that it wasn't just a random act of interference. The rumors pointed to a rival gang, the West End Crew, a brutal group with connections to some of the most dangerous players in the country. The West End Crew had been on Deacon's radar for months, and now they were actively trying to push him out. They weren't going to settle for second place, and Deacon's growing empire was an obstacle they weren't willing to overlook. Deacon had never been one to back down from a fight. He knew how to navigate through the kind of power struggles that marked the criminal world. He'd made enough deals, shaken enough hands, and collected enough favors to play the game as well as anyone. But the game was changing. Rivals weren't just testing him anymore. They were out to take him down. Things started to escalate quickly after the failed drug shipment. The West End Crew's men began appearing at Deacon's businesses, standing just a little too close, making veiled threats. The intimidation tactics were obvious, but Deacon wasn't someone who was easily intimidated. He had his own muscle, his own people who could handle the kind of heat that came with being a target. But the fact that these threats were coming from someone as established as the West End Crew put him in a difficult position. It wasn't a fight he could afford to lose. There were whispers that Deacon had made some enemies closer to home as well, not just outside his circle but within it. As the heat mounted, cracks began to form in his operations. Long-time associates who had once sworn loyalty to him were now looking for ways to protect their own interests. Some of them were scared. Others were greedy. Either way, betrayal was in the air. One night, just days after the failed shipment, Deacon received an anonymous letter. It was simple, blunt, and to the point. "You're next. Get out while you still can." No signature, no hint at who was behind it. But Deacon knew what it meant. It wasn't a warning, it was a declaration of war. And in the underworld, war wasn't fought with words, it was fought with blood. The pressure was mounting from all sides. Deacon's world, built on years of strategic moves, was beginning to crumble. His empire wasn't as solid as it once seemed. The people he had trusted were either wavering or taking their chances with the West End Crew. They saw the writing on the wall, and they weren't sticking around to watch Deacon fall. But Deacon wasn't one to back away from a fight. Not now. Not ever. He began to prepare for the inevitable. The game was changing, but he wasn't going down without a fight. He brought in more muscle, restructured his operations, and did what he had always done best. He made connections. But as the power struggles raged on, one thing was certain: the clock was ticking. The walls were closing in. The question now wasn't just about surviving the hit, it was about who would strike first, and whether Deacon's empire could withstand the storm that was coming. The underworld was starting to turn on him, and the weight of the enemies he had made was starting to catch up. The day Richard Deacon was killed started like any other. It was a brisk morning in Chasetown, and from the outside, nothing seemed unusual. His black Mercedes was parked in front of his home, the familiar hum of his business operating smoothly in the background. But beneath the surface, the tension had been building for weeks. Deacon had become a marked man, and every step he took seemed to push him closer to his inevitable downfall. Deacon had always been careful. He lived like a ghost, his movements planned, his interactions guarded. But that morning, there was something different. A small, subtle change. He made a phone call, one that seemed routine but would turn out to be a mistake. The call went out to a contact in London, arranging a meeting about a potential business deal. But unknown to Deacon, it was a move that had already been anticipated. The hitmen were already on their way. The hit was a long time coming, but the day it happened, it seemed almost too easy. For weeks, the West End crew had been setting the stage, watching Deacon's routine, learning his patterns. They had spent hours tracking his movements, waiting for the right moment to strike. And when it came, it was like a well-choreographed dance. Every detail had been meticulously planned. It wasn't just about killing Deacon, it was about sending a message. To anyone who might think they were untouchable, to anyone who had the audacity to believe they could challenge the power of the West End crew. Deacon was the last obstacle in their path, and removing him was just the first step in expanding their territory. That morning, Deacon drove his usual route to one of his properties in the center of town. He was alone, a mistake that would cost him. As he pulled into the driveway of the building, his car's engine cutting off with a low hum, the silence of the street seemed unsettlingly thick. It was a quiet residential area, but it had become anything but. The West End crew had already stationed men in every corner, blending in with the locals, waiting for the signal. I had been watching from a distance, tracking Deacon's movements. The air was thick with tension, but I didn't know this was the day. I hadn't gotten the tip-off yet, but something in my gut told me it was coming. It always does, doesn't it? You can feel it in the way the streets move, the way people talk, the way the tension builds up like static electricity. You don't need to be a genius to know when something's about to explode. As Deacon stepped out of the car, he looked around, instinctively scanning the street. He wasn't stupid, he knew the risks, but there was no sign of immediate danger. And that's when it happened. Two figures emerged from the alleyway across the street, their movements sharp, practiced. They moved with the quiet precision of men who had done this before. One was armed with a silenced pistol, the other with a knife. They approached quickly, but without hurry. Calm, controlled, as if they had done this 100 times before. Deacon didn't see them coming. He was too focused on the door in front of him. By the time he turned to see the two men moving toward him, it was too late. The first shot rang out, silenced but deadly, hitting Deacon square in the chest. He staggered backward, but he didn't fall, not yet. His eyes locked on the figures approaching him, his expression one of shock and disbelief. He tried to make a move, but the second shot hit him, this time in the throat. He dropped to his knees, blood spilling from his mouth, but still he fought for air. The second hitman stepped forward, knife raised. It wasn't just about killing him. It was about ensuring there were no mistakes. The final strike was quick, merciless. A slash across Deacon's throat, and that was it. His body slumped, lifeless, as the blood pooled around him, dark and unforgiving. The two men didn't waste time. They didn't celebrate their kill. They knew better. They were professionals. They'd been paid for this, and now that it was done, they had to disappear. Without a word, they turned and vanished into the alley, disappearing as quickly as they had come. I watched it all unfold from the distance, but I was too late to intervene. There were no signs of struggle, no sounds of chaos, just the sudden, jarring violence of a man being cut down in the prime of his power. Within moments, Deacon's body was lifeless, crumpled on the cold concrete. The street was eerily quiet, save for the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. And that was it. Richard Deacon, the man who had built an empire on the back of power and fear, was dead. The hit had been clean. The killers had done their job without hesitation. But there was one thing they didn't count on: the trail they left behind. The surveillance cameras in the area, the witnesses who saw the men leaving the scene, the few who could recall the brief flash of movement before the shots rang out. The hit was supposed to be a clean break, a quiet removal of a problem. But it wouldn't be that simple, because in the underworld, nothing stays buried forever, and someone would come looking for answers. The call came in just minutes after the hit. I was halfway through my shift when the phone rang, the voice on the other end calm, professional, but I could hear the urgency underneath. "Deacon's been hit," the officer said. "You need to get down here. It's all over." The scene was a mess of flashing lights and uniformed officers when I arrived. The area was cordoned off, but the crowd was already gathering. News outlets were beginning to pick up the story, and the whispers about the hit were spreading like wildfire. I stood there for a moment, taking in the scene. Deacon's body was still lying where it had fallen, his blood staining the pavement. The question now wasn't just why he had been killed, it was who was behind it and how they had pulled it off so cleanly. There was no struggle, no sign of a fight, just a body and the unmistakable evidence of a professional job. I could tell right away that this wasn't some random act of violence or a robbery gone wrong. The hitmen had been precise, efficient. Deacon had been killed in the blink of an eye, and the killers had disappeared without leaving a trace. It was almost too clean. The first thing I did was check the surveillance footage. There were cameras nearby, just enough to capture the two hitmen as they approached Deacon. The video wasn't crystal clear, but it was enough. The hitmen were dressed in dark clothes, wearing hoods, blending in with the early morning crowd. One of them raised a silenced pistol, and the other stayed back, watching for any signs of trouble. The footage didn't give us much. No clear faces, no clear identifiers. It was almost as if they had anticipated everything, as if they had planned this hit down to the smallest detail. The only thing we had were two shadows, vanishing into the night, leaving behind a dead man on the street. The forensics team arrived soon after, but the scene was almost too perfect. There were no fingerprints on the gun, no signs of struggle, and the knife used to finish Deacon off had been wiped clean. Whoever had done this knew what they were doing. They had left nothing behind but the body. No clues, no leads, just silence. The more I dug, the more I realized that Deacon had made enemies. He'd made plenty of them. The West End crew had been on his tail for months, and they had reason to want him gone. But there were others, too. People he had crossed over the years, people who resented his rise to power, people who wanted his territory. The problem was, we didn't have anything solid, just a list of suspects, a collection of names. And the same damn question: who pulled the trigger? I began to focus on Deacon's associates, the men he trusted, the ones he worked with day in and day out. They were the ones who might know something. I spoke to a few of them, trying to get a sense of who might have had the most to gain from Deacon's death. The answers were vague. No one wanted to talk. No one wanted to give up anything. And that wasn't surprising. The underworld works on silence. Loyalty is a currency that's paid in blood, and no one wanted to risk losing it by talking to the authorities. But there were cracks. I knew it. There always are. A few of Deacon's associates were nervous, their behavior a little too fidgety, their eyes darting around like they were trying to read the room. I picked up on it. I kept pushing, kept digging, until I found one man who was willing to talk, a small-time player who'd been with Deacon for a few years before he started feeling the pressure. He was scared. He didn't want to get involved, but he knew something. He had been close to Deacon, seen how the man worked. And more importantly, he had seen how Deacon had pissed off the wrong people. "Look," he said, his voice trembling. "I don't know who ordered it, but I know who did it. I saw them. They were part of the West End crew, but they weren't from around here. They came in, got what they needed, and got out. They knew exactly what they were doing." That was the breakthrough I needed. It wasn't much, but it was enough to start piecing things together. The West End crew had made their move, but they weren't alone in this. Someone else had been pulling the strings, someone with more to lose than just turf. Someone who had been watching Deacon from the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment. I started going through the connections, trying to find out who had the most to gain from Deacon's death. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about control, power. Deacon had been sitting on something valuable, something that could change the balance of power in the underworld. And now whoever had orchestrated this hit wanted to take it all. But the deeper I dug, the more I realized how far this went. Deacon had been a key player, but there were others involved, bigger players, ones who had been operating under the radar for years. The hit wasn't just a random act of violence, it was a calculated move in a much bigger game. Deacon was just a pawn. As I pieced it together, I started seeing the bigger picture. The more I learned, the more I understood that this wasn't just about the West End crew. This was about power, betrayal, and greed. And in the end, Deacon had been the one who paid the price for it all. But even as I closed in on the truth, I knew one thing: there would be no easy answers. In the underworld, the truth is always messy, and it always comes at a price. I was getting closer, but I wasn't sure who would come out on top. The deeper I went, the more dangerous this case became. And in a world like this, no one stays safe for long. Richard Deacon's assassination rippled through the streets of Chasetown. His death, planned and executed with precision, was meant to be a victory for the West End crew, but it quickly spiraled into something more chaotic. What should have been a clean power grab left a power vacuum that no one could fill easily. Deacon's network wasn't just about him, it was about the people who had worked for him, his connections, and his influence in the underworld. The crew had underestimated how deeply his reach had gone. Immediately after his death, Deacon's associates, scattered but still loyal, began to fight for control. The crew thought they could step in and take over, but the reality was far messier. The streets were rife with resistance. Smaller gangs saw opportunity, while former allies of Deacon's fought to maintain what they had left. The balance of power was shifting rapidly, and the West End crew was caught in the middle of a battle they hadn't expected. As the crew tried to assert control, they found themselves dealing with increasing violence and infighting. Deacon's death had been intended to bring stability to their reign, but instead it ignited a series of turf wars. The underworld was no longer in the hands of a single power. It had fractured into multiple factions, each trying to seize what Deacon had once commanded. For law enforcement, Deacon's murder was both a breakthrough and a dead end. The investigation revealed more than just a simple gangland hit. It exposed the intricate web of corruption and violence that had spread through the town. The deeper we dug, the more we realized that Deacon's death wasn't just about rivalry. It was about control of a much bigger piece of the pie. And the investigation itself became entangled in the same web of secrecy. In the end, justice was elusive. The West End crew had lost their momentum, but new players emerged to fill the gap. Deacon's empire had crumbled, but the chaos he left behind continued. The streets, though quieter, were no safer. The death of one man had sparked a chain reaction that no one could predict. For me, the case was closed. But the truth was, the story of Richard Deacon's rise and fall was far from over. The power shifts, the betrayals, the violence, none of it was finished. Deacon might be gone, but his legacy of chaos lingered, and the underworld would continue to turn, as it always did.